She did everything right. She left the relationship, blocked him online, told her friends that she was afraid, and even went to the police for help. But 12 days after ending things with her boyfriend, Molly McLaren would be brutally killed in broad daylight in a gym parking lot as people watched in horror. This is not a story about a crime that came out of nowhere. This is a story about warning signs that escalated in plain sight. This young woman trusted her instincts and reached out for help, but sadly, it was too late because obsession had already taken a deadly turn. Welcome to the True Crime Nurse, everybody. My name is Kat, and I'm a registered nurse who loves all things nursing and true crime. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the bell before you go. All right, my friends, let's get into today's case. Molly Joanne McLaren was born on May 26, 1994, and she was raised in Kent, United Kingdom by her parents, Joe and Doug McLaren. Bubbly was the best word to describe her growing up because Molly lit up every room that she walked into. Her parents described her as an emotionally intelligent young woman for her age because she was deeply sensitive to the moods and needs of other people around her. Molly was definitely an empath. These traits made her caring and compassionate, but they also made her vulnerable. As a teenager, Molly struggled with body image and sadly ended up struggling with disordered eating. This period of her life was not mild or brief. It was serious and at times life-threatening. Her parents later described it as the most terrifying experience of their lives, watching their daughter physically disappear while mentally retreating into an illness that distorted her perception of herself. Recovery meant that Molly needed professional treatment, and her family was an incredible support to her during that time. What matters the most about this period of time, though, is not the illness itself, but what followed. Molly survived it, and she was strong. She did the hard work of recovery, and she learned how to listen to her body rather than punish it. This experience really shaped her worldview, and it gave her empathy for people who were also struggling, not that she ever had any shortage of compassion towards others. As she moved into adulthood, Molly didn't hide this chapter of her life. She spoke openly about it, and she even shared her story online. Molly was able to reframe fitness as a measure of strength and balance, and she stopped obsessing over her physical appearance. By her early 20s, Molly was studying health and fitness at the University of Kent, and she chose this field deliberately because this was something that had created such an incredible impact on her life. She wanted to help others develop healthier relationships with their bodies too, and their mental health, and this really shows us what a beautiful heart that she had. She worked part-time, maintained friendships, exercised frequently, and planned for a future that included a meaningful career where she could help others. But in July of 2016, Molly met a man named Joshua Stimpson through a well-known dating app called Tinder. At the time, online dating was a very normal part of her social life, and she wasn't looking for anything serious. But Joshua initially presented himself as this attentive, emotionally expressive, and vulnerable young man. Early on in the relationship, though, he shared with Molly that he struggled with mental health issues, and he told her that he's bipolar. Him showing this level of vulnerability was actually enticing to Molly. Having lived with mental illness herself, she didn't see this as a red flag or a reason to run away. Instead, she felt that honesty about mental health meant that she could trust him. She believed that with treatment and support, people could manage their conditions and thrive just like she had. Her parents later said that Joshua being bipolar did concern them a little bit, but Molly reassured them that he was receiving proper care and that she felt capable of navigating this relationship. They trusted their daughter's judgment. The relationship got serious pretty quickly. Within just weeks, Joshua had basically moved into the McLaren home because he spent almost every night there and just sort of integrated himself into Molly's daily life. Her parents allowed this because, once again, they trusted their daughter and saw no clear signs of immediate danger. At this time, Joshua didn't seem physically aggressive or threatening whatsoever, and instead, he seemed polite, reserved, and emotionally fragile. Even though there were no overt signs, the speed of the progression in their relationship itself could have been a warning sign, especially when intimacy develops faster than stability does. In fact, Joshua's quick attachment to Molly and her environment was a growing dependency that would later turn dangerous, but nobody saw it coming. As the months passed, subtle shifts started to happen. Friends said that Joshua was becoming increasingly possessive. He became resentful of Molly's independence and uncomfortable with her spending any time away from him. He questioned her on every little thing that she did, especially with her male friends, and he would get upset whenever he felt rejected. Arguments were volatile and emotionally charged, and when Molly tried to set boundaries or settle an argument with him, Joshua responded with huge mood swings, withdrawal, or hostility towards her. Molly adapted to the swings and she began to learn how to manage his emotions in addition to her own, which is a very unhealthy dynamic to be in. If anyone listening can relate to this feeling, please talk to someone or seek help because this is not normal. She adjusted her behavior to avoid triggering him, and I'm sure that most of us here have heard of this, but this is what we call that walking on eggshells type of feeling. She explained away his reactions to her friends, saying that he was just stressed or possibly having a mental health crisis, but his pattern is very common in relationships that are taking a toxic turn. The partner who's being controlled typically doesn't see it as anything out of the norm because it develops gradually. By the time you see the signs, it can be too late. Even though she defended his actions to other people, Molly began to feel really unsettled in the relationship. She confided to her close friends that Joshua could be really manipulative and verbally cruel whenever he was upset, and that she felt at fault or responsible for his emotions. I want to add here that at this point in today's case, things hadn't become physical yet, but as you can see, these red flags are quickly adding up. What Molly couldn't see, though, was that Joshua's behavior followed a very familiar pattern. Not one, but two former girlfriends later testified about their experiences with him, and they both said that the relationships escalated quickly, then followed by controlling behavior and an inability to accept rejection. One of them even contacted police years earlier after becoming afraid of him, and the other one talked about frequent harassment after attempting to end the relationship. It's heartbreaking to know that this was something that multiple women had experienced with him, and Molly was trying her hardest to get away from it. She had no idea that she wasn't the first to experience this side of him. By mid 2017, Molly had finally reached a point of emotional exhaustion. She was done. She no longer felt safe or supported in the relationship, and she felt that her role had shifted from partner to emotional caretaker, and she was losing herself in this process. On June 17th, 2017, she ended the relationship. For Molly, this breakup needed to happen for her own mental health, but for Joshua, this was a profound injury to his sense of control and identity, and he did not accept it. What happened after the breakup was complete and utter chaos. Remember how Joshua was really volatile while in the relationship? Well, these things worsened, and he was outwardly showing extreme anger and even fixation on Molly. Joshua did not accept Molly's decision as final, and he interpreted this as rejection that needed to be corrected. This distinction is extremely important, guys. In healthy breakups, separation is of course painful, but it's at least somewhat respected on both sides. But with cases of stalking or people that react the way that Joshua did, the breakup is seen as unfair and something that needs to be fixed or even worse, vindicated. Joshua began harassing and contacting Molly repeatedly. The messages were all over the place, alternating between pleading to get back together and wild accusations that Molly had been cruel and disloyal to him. When she didn't respond to his messages, he became even more aggressive, and he even accused her of abandoning him and questioned her character. What he said in all these messages just reflected how angry he was, and he could not stand that he had lost control over her. Molly didn't engage at all. She told her friends that she wanted a clean breakup and believed that replying would only extend the situation, so she blocked him on social media and attempted to limit contact. This is usually the best thing to do in cases like this, but it can also escalate behavior in people who are already fixated and losing control. Within just a few days, Joshua took this issue public. He started posting on Facebook, accusing Molly of using hard substances, and these posts were not vague or indirect at all. His posts named her directly, and people in her social and academic circles could see it. For Molly, this was extremely upsetting. Her recovery and her future career meant that her reputation was on the line, both personally and professionally. Accusations like this were not only false, but they were humiliating for Molly. Public humiliation is a common tactic in stalking behavior. People do this to punish their victim, to try to regain the control, and force them to panic to the point of reaching out to them to resolve the issue. For Joshua, these posts meant that Molly would see what he did even if she didn't respond to him directly, and he wanted her to feel forced into reaching out to him to take them down. That is just sadistic. Molly now felt genuinely afraid of him, and she told her friends that she felt constantly on edge. She described feeling watched and worried that Joshua would appear somewhere unexpectedly, and her parents were about to leave to go travel. So the idea of her being alone only heightened her anxiety. She talked about her concerns openly, and Molly was not minimizing her fears or dismissing them at all as an overreaction. She truly felt that she was in danger. Molly began taking precautions and she adjusted all of her routines. She even went so far as to warn her neighbors to please be on alert for her. On June 22nd, 2017, Molly took a step that many stalking victims should take. She went to the North Kent police station to report Joshua's behavior. She explained that he was harassing her online and refusing to leave her alone, and this was not a casual complaint. This was a request for intervention and a cry for help. Be prepared to get really angry about what happens next. At the station, an officer called Joshua while Molly was standing right there. She chose not to engage with his Facebook post, and now the officer is going to call him right in front of her. This call was placed on speakerphone, and Joshua was warned that his behavior was unwanted and that he needed to stop contacting her. During that call, the officer told Molly not to return to the station because of Joshua, and he said, "Wouldn't we?" His tone was sarcastic and dismissive, so in my opinion, the cops should have known right then and there that he wasn't taking them seriously. When he said, "Wouldn't we?" I kind of took that as him wanting her to go back there so that he could run into her at the station, but let me know how you took it. No arrests or charges were made, and no restraining order was issued at that time. Molly was told to keep Joshua blocked and report any further incidents if they occurred. This is a major problem in stalking cases. Because nothing physical had happened yet and the posts were online, the situation was treated as low risk, but Molly left the police station without the protection that she needed. Joshua didn't stop after the police warning, and instead, his fixation only got worse. He didn't take the warning seriously whatsoever, and instead, he saw this now as a challenge. He continued monitoring all of Molly's movements and knew her whole entire routine. He knew where she lived, where she studied, where she exercised, and what Molly didn't know was that Joshua had begun to prepare. On June 27th, 2017, just 2 days before today's case takes place, Joshua went to the store in Chatham and he purchased a kitchen paring knife. CCTV footage captured him walking through the store calmly, picking up the item, and paying for it without any hesitation or thought. About 30 minutes later, he went to another nearby store and bought a pickaxe. Again, he bought this, and there was no visible signs of distress or agitation on him. During these final days, Molly attempted to maintain a sense of normalcy. She continued to go see her friends, go to the gym, and she stayed close to her family and talked about her fears. She did not believe that she was in immediate danger of being murdered, and like many stalking victims, she knew that there would be continued harassment, but she had no idea it would go this far. This gap between the perceived risk and actual danger is one of the saddest parts of stalking-related homicides. The behavior is terrifying, but the escalation to murder always seems impossible until it happens. On the morning of June 29th, 2017, Molly went to Pure Gym at the Dockside Outlet in Chatham. Exercise was an important part of her routine and her recovery, and inside the gym on that day, she ran into Joshua. He placed his mat directly next to hers, and this was deliberate, not accidental. Molly immediately realized that she was in grave danger. She quickly texted her mom and then called her, and she told her mom that Joshua was there and he had positioned himself to be right next to her. Her mother told her to leave immediately and get somewhere safe, and Molly did not hesitate. She gathered all of her belongings and walked out of the gym, but Joshua followed. What had been unfolding over the last 12 days was about to reach its final and most life-altering moment. By the time Molly McLaren walked out of Pier Gym, she had no way of knowing what Joshua Stimpson was capable of. What she did know was that the man that she had tried to leave behind had followed her into a space where she should have been safe. CCTV footage showed Molly exiting the gym, and Joshua followed very quickly after her. The Dockside complex in Chatham is kind of like a mall in that there are a variety of shops there. The parking lot is for multiple businesses, including stores, restaurants, and the gym. On a weekday morning, it is active but not crowded, and there are people coming and going, but not enough to guarantee immediate intervention. Molly walked towards her Ford Focus in the parking lot, and she was still on high alert, but her goal was to just quickly get to her car and leave the area. She unlocked the car, got into her driver's seat, and shut the door. Joshua approached from behind, and witnesses later described seeing him move quickly and purposefully towards Molly in her car. There was no argument, no yelling, and no attempt at conversation whatsoever. As Molly began to start the engine, Joshua reached the driver's side door, ripped it open, and immediately attacked. Molly screamed a horrifying scream. This was heard by several people in the parking lot because it was so loud, sudden, and unmistakable. Joshua was armed with a kitchen knife that he'd bought just 2 days before, and the first blows were directed at Molly's neck and upper body. This was deliberate. He stabbed her repeatedly, delivering blow after blow in a violent rage. Eyewitnesses later described the attack as relentless, and one witness said that Joshua was continuously stabbing Molly in the neck and head. Another described the movement as mechanical, almost as if he had no clue that anything else was going on around him. There was no pause or hesitation. A bystander named Benjamin Morton, who was just walking his dog nearby, ran towards the car when he realized what was happening. He yelled at Joshua to stop and attempted to pull him away from Molly, but despite his best efforts, he was unable to break Joshua's grip or stop the attack. Joshua was physically stronger and fully committed to what he was doing, and he was so locked in it was almost as if he was in a trance. Another witness named Cody Jarvis saw Joshua's car arrive shortly before the attack and watched as he ran towards Molly's vehicle. She heard screaming and saw people trying to intervene, and she emphasized the speed and violence of the assault too. At some point, the attack stopped though. Witnesses described a sudden shift when Joshua stepped back from the car. The frenzy had just ended just as quickly as it had begun, and he didn't even attempt to run away or hide what he had just done. When the police arrived, he stood there calmly and cooperated as he was arrested. He even raised his hands to volunteer and say that he was the guy that they were looking for. This is so chilling and eerie. Emergency services were called immediately, and paramedics arrived to find Molly covered in blood inside of her car. The extent of Molly's injuries were immediately apparent, and despite rapid transport to the hospital, she was pronounced dead shortly upon arrival. There was no real chance of saving her life, and we're going to get into the full extent of her injuries once we go over the autopsy. But for Molly's parents, the hours that followed were a blur and agonizing. They first became aware that something was wrong when news alerts began circulating about a fatal stabbing at the Dockside complex in Chatham, and they realized that the location was their daughter's gym. They waited for the confirmation, hoping that it wasn't their daughter. Later that day, police came to their door and told them that Molly McLaren had been killed at just 23 years old. This next section is going to be really difficult to talk about because the autopsy paints a picture of exactly what Molly endured, so just be prepared. According to the autopsy, Molly sustained multiple incised lacerations or cuts to her head and scalp. These were sharp force cuts to the head, and she also had deep gashes. Because the scalp has an extremely rich blood supply, these wounds would have bled heavily. Even small cuts to the scalp could bleed much more than you would expect if it's not getting under control, and in this case, the report mentions numerous scalp lacerations. Although her scalp was repeatedly struck, the brain itself was not directly hit, so there were no skull fractures or brain tissue injuries mentioned in the report. Molly also had sharp lacerations near the forehead and temple area of her face. These wounds were more superficial and they didn't penetrate down to the bone. From a nursing perspective, head wounds, even without skull fractures, can cause significant pain, disorientation, and bleeding, but we're going to talk about whether or not she would have been alert for most of these injuries in just a minute. The autopsy also found a deep, gaping slash across the front of Molly's neck, and this completely transected or cut through Molly's throat. Her airway was completely severed, and a cut this deep would have sliced through the soft tissues, including the trachea or windpipe, and the major blood vessels and nerves. The ME said that Molly's neck was completely open from the larynx down, and a completely severed trachea eliminates any possibility of breathing. Air cannot reach the lungs through the normal route, so instead, air and blood would escape out of the open wound. Molly would have lost her airway immediately. Even if she attempted to breathe, air would leak out of the neck instead of inflating her lungs, and with the lungs cut off, oxygen could no longer reach her brain and vital organs. Cerebral ischemia, or loss of blood and oxygen to the brain, would set in within seconds, and interrupting that pathway causes unconsciousness in just about 10 seconds. The autopsy also mentioned extensive hemorrhaging around the neck, and this is evidence that the carotid arteries, which supply blood to the brain, and jugular veins, which drains blood from the head to the heart, were also both cut through. These vessels carry a large volume of blood per minute. Severing a carotid artery leads to massive, rapid blood loss, and a hemorrhage from the neck vessels alone would have caused a fast drop in blood pressure. This is referred to as hemorrhagic or hypovolemic shock from exsanguination. Within a minute or two, blood pressure would plummet and vital organs would fail without blood flow. And this, plus the severed airway, means that these injuries would have undoubtedly been fatal. Molly also sustained multiple stab wounds to the chest. The ME counted at least 75 separate stab wounds, some of which went all the way into her pleural cavity, which impacts the ability to breathe as well. In Molly's case, this type of chest wound created an open channel from the outside air into her chest cavity, and air would rush in with each attempt at taking a breath, collapsing that lung and severely limiting her ability to breathe. Molly also had numerous cuts on her arms and her hands, which we know are classic defensive wounds. Even being caught off guard, she tried her very best to put up a fight. Investigators found deep lacerations on her forearms and her palms, and this comes from her instinctively raising her arms to block the attack. This means that she was conscious and actively resisting as the attack started. Molly also had stab wounds on her shoulder and her upper back, and one deep wound on the right shoulder blade penetrated through the muscle almost to the shoulder joint. There was also another deep stab wound on her upper back that went through the trap muscle. The location of these wounds tell us that the attacker was swinging the blade rapidly across her body, and each additional stab wound to the shoulder or back just increased the amount of trauma that she was already suffering. These were not the most fatal injuries that she had, though, because the neck and chest were definitely the lethal ones, but they contributed to the blood loss and tissue damage. This tells us how badly Joshua wanted her to suffer. Several stab wounds were also found on Molly's lower torso and hip region, and these were consistent with the attacker reaching downwards as she was sitting in the car. One wound in the left flank area near her kidney was stabbed deeply, and a second stab on her right hip went through her gluteal muscle but didn't penetrate down to the pelvic bone. Molly sustained multiple wounds and cuts on her thighs, especially on the left thigh. These were deep, long gashes through the muscle, and one particularly deep stab in the left thigh was mentioned to be nearly down to her femur bone. Overall, Molly's injuries were horrendous and all over. The neck wound alone cut off her airway and blood flow to the brain, which would have made her go instantly unconscious. Simultaneously, she sustained multiple lacerations to her chest, abdomen, pelvis, thighs, and arms as she poured out blood everywhere and onto the ground. Respiratory failure compounded all of this with her trachea severed. The fact that she sustained 75 stab and slash wounds from her scalp to her thighs, including a gaping wound to the neck, was truly an unsurvivable level of violence. Molly McLaren's body did not sustain life after these injuries. Now that we know the full extent of what Molly suffered through, when police and emergency services arrived on scene, there was zero doubt about what happened here. The scene and Joshua made it clear that this was a homicide. The goal was then to reconstruct exactly how everything happened, and investigators needed to know how long it lasted, if there had been any fight or struggle, and whether the evidence supported premeditation or not. The parking lot was shut down and treated as a major crime scene. The officers extended the area well beyond Molly's car because the amount of blood present and the number of witnesses who had been in the area during the attack. In cases like this that involve extensive trauma, bloodstain evidence can travel much farther than expected, so preserving the integrity of the entire scene is critical. Blood had pooled on the ground beneath where Joshua was standing, and this meant that significant bleeding occurred while the door was still open and the victim was still inside the car. This finding supports when the witnesses said that the attack began while Molly was just sitting in the driver's seat and continued with her inside the car. Bloodstain pattern analysis from inside the car showed multiple points of impact and movement within that small space. The pattern of blood showed that Molly was attacked at close range and that the assailant remained in the same position at the driver's side throughout the entirety of the attack. There was no evidence that she ever left the vehicle or even tried to run away. She didn't leave until they removed her body from the car lifeless. The murder weapon was recovered from the scene, which was the kitchen paring knife. The knife was heavily bloodstained and the handle was still intact. Even though there was no question, forensic examinations confirmed that Joshua Stimpson's fingerprints were all over the knife. No other fingerprints were found on the weapon, so this eliminated any chance of someone else being involved in the murder. The knife was taken into evidence, and it was later matched to the CCTV footage showing Stimson buying it just 2 days before. Joshua's vehicle was still parked nearby, and it was also seized and brought in as evidence. Inside his car, investigators found a pickaxe that was purchased on June 27, 2017. Even though it wasn't used in the attack, him even having it shows that he came prepared for this attack and he had a backup weapon if this knife wasn't enough. Investigators view this as corroborating evidence that Stimson had anticipated what was going to happen. CCTV footage became one of the most important pieces of this investigation. Cameras from multiple locations were reviewed, including the gym entrance, the parking lot, and surrounding stores. The footage showed Molly exiting the gym first, and then she was followed out by Joshua. The time gap between their exits was very short, and this confirmed that he was tracking her movements rather than coincidentally leaving at the same time. The footage captured Joshua moving directly towards Molly's vehicle, almost as if he was a shark in the water. He didn't even pause for a moment to hesitate. There was no footage showing an argument or confrontation prior to the attack, and this absence was important because it shut down any suggestion that the violence was triggered by something that Molly said or did in that parking lot. Additional CCTV footage from the 27th showed Joshua buying the knife and pickaxe, and in those videos, they noted that he appeared calm. Now, I want to circle back to the witnesses for just a minute. Several people had seen or heard parts of the attack, and officers separated the witnesses immediately to prevent anyone from influencing each other's stories. Statements were taken individually and then compared for consistency, and their stories all aligned pretty closely on the most important details. Witnesses described hearing Molly scream, seeing Joshua at the driver's side door, and then seeing him repeatedly stabbing towards her upper neck and body. They also mentioned attempts to intervene and the attacker's refusal to stop. Paramedics and first responders also gave their statements, and they described arriving to find Molly with catastrophic injuries and massive blood loss. Their observations supported the idea that her injuries were incompatible with life and that death would have occurred rapidly. They also described Joshua's demeanor as calm and compliant at the time of arrest, and this behavior would be talked about later on in trial. Investigators also looked into Molly's prior contact with the police, and her report on June 22, 2017, included the recorded phone call when an officer warned Joshua to stop contacting her. The timing of that warning, just 1 week before the murder, became a key point, and it was disturbing. Something new that I learned in my research for today's story is that as part of standard procedure in cases that involve domestic or stalking-related homicides, police in the UK will refer themselves for an independent review. This step is taken to see if any opportunities for intervention may have been missed or whether or not the response to Molly's report met the appropriate standards. I love that the UK does this. So, Kent police submitted themselves for an independent review. By the time the investigation wrapped up, there was a clear picture that was supported by the evidence. Joshua had stalked Molly after their breakup, ignored what the police told him, purchased weapons days in advance, followed her to the gym, and then brutally murdered her in public. When Joshua Stimpson was finally brought before the court, there was never any question about who killed Molly McLaren. The identity of the attacker was established, and he was arrested immediately. Multiple eyewitnesses saw the attack unfold. CCTV footage documented his movements before and after the killing, and the knife had already been recovered. The forensic evidence was overwhelming in this case. So this case was essentially an open and shut, but the central legal question here was not whether or not Joshua Stimpson killed Molly McLaren. The question was he criminally responsible for murder, or could his mental state reduce this to manslaughter by reason of diminished responsibility? That distinction would determine whether Molly's death was legally recognized as an act of intentional murder, or was his mental health to blame? And remember, he was diagnosed bipolar, so this did play a role as well. The trial took place at Maidstone Crown Court in early 2018, and from the very beginning, the prosecution made it clear that this was not a case of Joshua losing control. They argued that all the evidence showed planning, preparation, and purposeful execution. A timeline was laid out for the jury, and the prosecutors really emphasized the breakup, the stalking behavior, the harmful social media posts, and the police warning that was issued just 1 week before the murder. They emphasized Joshua's refusal to leave Molly alone after being told explicitly to do so, and they presented this as evidence of obsession rather than him snapping. Purchasing the weapons a couple of days before was a major focal point in the prosecution's case too. CCTV footage showing Joshua calmly buy the knife and the pickaxe was shown in court, and the prosecution argued that this single act dismantled any idea that this happened spontaneously. A person who buys a weapon in advance, carries it to a location that their former partner is, and then uses it in a targeted manner is not acting on sudden impulse. Witness testimony was presented next, and several bystanders described the attack, and it was a very emotional moment in that courtroom. They described Molly's screams, how violent and fast the assault was, and the repeated stabbing that was focused to her neck and head. One witness talked about trying to intervene and said that he was unable to pull Joshua away. Another witness described the sudden silence when the attack ended. Paramedics and police officers testified about the scene, about Joshua's demeanor after the killing, and they described him as calm and compliant, and this detail mattered. The prosecution argued that his composure immediately after the attack was inconsistent with someone who had suddenly lost control. The forensic pathologist's take formed a critical bridge between the physical evidence and the question of intent. The jury heard about the number of wounds, the concentration of injuries to the vital areas, and the fact that many of the wounds were inflicted after Molly would have already lost consciousness. These horrific injuries required sustained effort by Joshua. The defense did not deny that Joshua killed Molly, but instead, they argued that he should not be convicted of murder because he was suffering from a mental health disorder that substantially impaired his ability to form any rational judgment or control. Psychiatric experts were called to testify about Joshua's mental health, and they talked about his troubled childhood, unstable relationships, and a diagnosis of borderline and bipolar personality disorder. He was known to be bipolar, but the borderline diagnosis was new based on the eval. The defense said that features of these disorders include fear of abandonment, emotional dysregulation, and being impulsive. They argued that the breakup triggered a psychological snap that led to this murder. Prosecutors challenged this, and they didn't argue that Joshua had mental health issues. Instead, they argued that having a mental health disorder does not eliminate responsibility, especially when there's evidence of planning. Let me know your thoughts on this in the comments because I'm curious to see what you think. The jury was told that diminished responsibility requires more than distress or emotional instability. It requires proof that a mental disorder substantially impaired the defendant's ability to understand what he did, form rational judgment, or exercise self-control at the time of the murder. They were asked to consider whether or not Joshua's actions reflected impairment or if they reflected intent. After closing judgments, the jury deliberations were quick. After less than 4 hours, they returned a unanimous verdict of guilty of murder. Sentencing took place immediately, and the courtroom was silent as the judge addressed Joshua directly. She described the killing as cruel, calculated, and cowardly, and she stated that he had planned to punish Molly for ending the relationship. She rejected any idea that this was an act of uncontrolled emotion, just like the jury had. The judge emphasized that Joshua had stalked Molly, ignored the police, and planned the attack. She said his actions were an act of revenge rather than desperation, and that Molly had done nothing wrong. She simply exercised her right to end the relationship. Joshua Stimpson was sentenced to life imprisonment with a minimum term of 26 years before he'll be eligible for parole. Victim impact statements were read in court, and Molly's family described the complete and utter devastation of losing her. They spoke about her kindness, her resilience, and the future that she would never have because of him. They described living with permanent grief and the knowledge that her death absolutely could have been prevented. After the trial, the case led to a lot of discussion in the UK about stalking laws, police response to harassment complaints, and the dangers from former partners who refused to accept rejection. These conversations are incredibly important, but I just hope that it leads to real change because there is no reason that this should have happened. We have seen it too many times where a victim goes through the appropriate channels for help and yet they still lose their life, and it is infuriating. I'm sending Molly and her loved ones all my love, and I hope that she is resting peacefully. Thank you so much for spending time with me today and listening to Molly's story. The details of today's case are so disturbing, and every case haunts me, to be completely honest with you, but I still cannot believe the way that Molly's life was so brutally taken in broad daylight. Make sure to go take a walk, get some sunlight, and do things that are good for your soul this week. Don't forget to drop our blue butterfly secret handshake in the chat if you made it this far, and please, please take great care of yourselves this week. Nurses orders. I'll see you next weekend. Bye.